This is True Criminals.
Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
One 81-year-old man said that he was asleep at home when the torchlight hit him in the face. He couldn't see much, but he was aware of the intruder's mask and gloves, and he felt, I don't know why, but he felt that this was an intruder who had done this before, somebody who was confident. At one point, the victim tried to fend off Grant by playing dead. Grant checked his pulse and told him, "There's nothing wrong with you."
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld, with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
He was nicknamed the Night Stalker by police and the local press. He spent years terrorising elderly people across southeast London, breaking into houses, stealing, and then something much worse. In this double episode, we're exploring the crimes of Delroy Grant, a man police believe was responsible for more than 200 offences over nearly 2 decades before his arrest in late 2009. In this episode, we explore the timeline of the case and Martin's memories of reporting it. In the next episode, we'll bring you the story from inside the police investigation, a conversation with retired Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton. Colin was the detective brought in to take a fresh look at Operation Minstead, the biggest serial sex attacks case the force had ever investigated. And his approach helped bring it to an end. Martin, not surprisingly, you covered this case for Sky News. What are your memories of it?
There are lots of memories, Helen. The idea that somebody was breaking into the homes of very elderly women and raping them was quite extraordinary. And so many of them, I'd reported on nothing like this at all. And many of those victims, of course, had severe health issues, dementia, Parkinson's disease, and they were woken up. It's difficult to imagine what they went through, but woken up with a torch shining in their faces and then subjected, in almost all cases, to some kind of terrifying ordeal. I mean, the first and the eldest rape victim was 89. I mean, that's quite unbelievable. And the other thing I suppose I remember from covering the case was I learned a new word, gerontophile.
Gerontophile? What's a gerontophile?
Well, you know, paedophile, somebody with an interest in young people, young children. A gerontophile is somebody with a sexual interest in much older people. And that's how psychologists described Delroy Grant.
It really is a horrific story, this one. And I think what's also really striking about it is how long it went on for before he was caught.
17 years, as far as police could tell. I mean, they know when he stopped because he stopped when he was arrested, but they've no real idea exactly when it was that he began. They can't be certain of that because although they think he was beginning to start his spate of burglaries in 1991, there may well have been other attacks, even more serious attacks and sexual attacks before then that went unreported because the victims were embarrassed, confused. Who knows? So it was a long reign of terror, but it might well be longer.
And then, of course, you've got the story inside the story is how did he get away with this so long? Why wasn't he caught earlier?
Well, he could have been caught much sooner. I mean, that became clear after his arrest. And we'll explore the details of that later. He was clever. He was also careless, though, because he didn't use a condom. and he left his DNA. So the man who wore gloves to avoid depositing his fingerprints was leaving his DNA over, well, more, I think something like a dozen of those crime scenes. But even though he left his DNA, because he hadn't been in trouble with the police before, his DNA wasn't on the police database. And we're going back a long time. The police database in those days was quite small. If his DNA wasn't on the database, then there was nothing to compare with it.
You saw him in court, I think, Martin. What was your impression of him?
Outwardly quite ordinary, I suppose, like most villains. Monsters do not look like monsters.
They don't, do they?
He was 53, a father of 10, 11 kids, nobody's quite sure, 5 different women, and the carer for his then current wife, who was wheelchair bound with multiple sclerosis. Clearly, this was a man who'd been leading a big double life.
Like a lot of the criminals, actually, we've talked about in previous episodes. Let's go back to the beginning, if we can, Martin, and some of the detail of the case. How did all of this begin?
Well, police believe that Delroy Grant started doing burglaries in 1991. But the first sexual Night Stalker style attack was the following year, in October 1992. He broke into a bungalow near Croydon, South London, and raped an 89-year-old spinster. A police account was later read out in court, and that gave a real sense of his methods. And this is what the police said. Her bedroom door opened. She saw a man. His face was covered by a balaclava. He went over to her and forced a black glove over her mouth. He shouted at her to be quiet. She asked whether he wanted money. She gave him £25 from her purse. He took the bulb from her lamp. He then raped her. A very chilling police account of that first victim.
It's really hard to even imagine that scenario. We've all got elderly relatives in our families, grandmas, elderly aunts, and to imagine that somebody could be put through something like that really is horrific. But by the late 90s, that pattern of behaviour became his MO, I suppose, if you like, didn't it?
It did. I mean, he picked quiet suburban areas. Then he would target old people living alone, often in bungalows, which I suppose to him indicated that there could be elderly people there. Houses with handrails that he could either look through the windows and see handrails leading up the stairs, or even steps up to those houses outdoors that had handrails. Again, an indicator to him that old people live there. He would also choose houses with easy rear access. He'd break in by removing a window pane. And then beyond that, he would disable the house in a way by unscrewing light bulbs and sometimes cutting phone lines and electricity. He would then wake victims with a torch beam in their faces. He usually wore a balaclava. One 81-year-old man said that he was asleep at home when the torchlight hit him in the face. He couldn't see much, but he was aware of the intruder's mask and gloves. And he felt, I don't know why, but he felt that this was an intruder who had done this before, somebody who was confident. At one point, the victim tried to fend off Grant by playing dead. And this is an indication of his methods and controlling nature. Grant checked his pulse and told him, "There's nothing wrong with you."
Oh, my goodness. And he was physically brutal too, wasn't he?
He was on many occasions. I mean, there were moments, attacks, where he wasn't like that. I mean, I suppose the crimes that were burglaries are no more than that. But there were some pretty awful stories from those victims. One victim, who the police called Rosie, was 88. She was living in Orpington, so within that area, in 1999. It had been a perfectly ordinary evening. She'd actually been to church. In court, we heard how she was raped twice and left with catastrophic injuries that included a perforated bladder. Unimaginable, isn't it?
Oh, it's just absolutely horrific. And it sounds like he preyed on the fact that he could make his victims feel really helpless.
She told the court in a statement, "I cannot emphasize enough my feelings of embarrassment and humiliation during the attack and subsequently." I feared for my life and I believed I was going to be murdered. Now, it's difficult to imagine a worse ordeal for an elderly person. I mean, imagine, Helen, somebody doing that to your grandmother.
Yeah. And I would imagine that when he did finally face trial, a lot of people at home watched and thought about that and how terrifying that would have been. Did his crimes change over time?
They did. Early on, he appeared to have been bolder, and he was operating in houses close, or bungalows, close to main roads, and he was nearly caught. Later, he became more cautious. He shifted to side streets and spent less time inside a victim's house. He became more skillful, if you like, a criminal, learning how to stay undetected. And it worked because he was undetected for many years.
For many, many, many years. When did police start to connect the dots and realise that, this was one person conducting all these crimes?
Well, Operation Minstead, that began to draw all these crimes together, was launched in 1998. And that followed detectives forensically linking that first attack in 1992, that 89-year-old spinster, with a second rape in 1997. In fact, there was a great period of no attacks, but they managed over those 5 years to link those two. And by the summer of 2003, police were linking a series of break-ins and sexual attacks to the same offender. So that's when they really began to focus on the idea that there was one predator out there. It became a manhunt, but it was 11 years after that first rape.
And I suppose the nature of the Night Stalker's crimes meant that there weren't really eyewitnesses. But what about DNA?
Well, the same DNA was found at many of the crime scenes, not all, but it showed that the detectives should be concentrating on one criminal.
But having a DNA didn't necessarily lead to a name, did it?
No, I mean, having somebody's DNA isn't the breakthrough that many people think, because you need to match it on the DNA sample on the police database. But in the early 2000s, that database was quite small, and police had no match for Grant's DNA simply because he wasn't on it. He hadn't been arrested or charged with any offence, so he'd never been asked to give police his DNA.
So he still wasn't caught. What happened next?
They moved to ancestral analysis of the DNA, which suggested to them that it was somebody with a Caribbean background. So police carried out mass DNA screenings, asking volunteers to give samples. It caused an awful lot of controversy for the way it targeted black men in southeast London. They knew that they were looking for somebody probably in southeast London, but it was difficult to explain, I think, to communities that it was only black men that they were interested in. The investigation built quite a list of potential suspects. At one point, there was something like 21,500 people of interest. That's how police described them. By 2006, 4,500 people had been DNA tested and ruled out. It wasn't traditional detective work. What it was screening on an industrial scale.
And there were missed chances by the police.
There were, but there was a key missed opportunity in 1999. There was a burglary linked to the Night Stalker. A witness had noted down a number plate and saw a man with a balaclava, very important clues that were passed on to the police. But through a confusion over names and failures to follow up, the wrong man's DNA was checked and Delroy Grant wasn't arrested. They focused on another man with the same name, Delroy Grant. They checked the wrong Delroy Grant and ruled him out, and it was very difficult to recover after that. It was a blunder that effectively allowed him to carry on for another, decade? And the bulk of his attacks occurred after that moment. I mean, he wasn't attacking constantly year in, year out. There were lulls, years of no crimes or none that were reported. And I think that made it difficult for the police. And then, of course, there were periods where the crime surged. But if you're not active, you're harder to catch.
It's awful to think, isn't it, Martin, that because of, presumably an innocent blunder, that there were 10 more years worth of crimes that were committed because of that and because somebody had got obviously the same name.
And hundreds of victims. I mean, it's very difficult to defend that. In fact, the police wouldn't defend it. I mean, they were very apologetic. But apart from that, there was also a tip-off after a Crime Watch appeal in 2001 where Delroy Grant's name was mentioned. But again, for some reason, it wasn't followed up and he wasn't paid a visit by detectives.
Hello and welcome to True Criminals. As you may have noticed, our podcast is now available on YouTube in full video format.
If you enjoy the show and want to help us grow, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. You can also leave a comment and join the conversation around the topics we cover.
You can also support the show by becoming a Patreon member.
We have 2 membership options available. Our ad-free tier lets you listen completely uninterrupted, and if you stay with us for 3 months, you'll receive an exclusive True Criminals mug as a thank you. Or you can become a True Criminals Insider, where you'll get our ad-free and extended episodes, including bonus material like the extended version of this episode. Just head over to patreon.com/True Criminals.
And now, Martin, back to the show. And the police got some serious traction, I think, by the late 2000s, didn't they?
Yeah, this is where Colin Sutton comes into the investigation. And that's a part of the story that we'll cover in detail in our next episode with Colin's unique perspective from inside the investigation. But in outline, in 2009, Colin Sutton was brought in and he shifted the focus of Operation Minstead and he made it more proactive, old-fashioned policing, if you like. Instead of waiting for the DNA to pop up on the database, he decided that surveillance was the way forward, a net, a trap designed to catch the Night Stalker in the act, rather than hoping that there would be a DNA match.
So what was this trap like?
Highly resource intensive. Around 70 officers were involved in surveillance in Shirley, South London. This was an area linked to many of the crimes, and it meant for those carrying out this surveillance long, cold nights and an awful lot of patience. There were near misses, but eventually there was a break. Some CCTV footage, a suspicious car, a man running around in Shirley after midnight. And police followed a car some miles into Penge, another area of southeast London, and stopped it. And inside was Delroy Grant, this time the right Delroy Grant. And inside the car were tools and clothing that, were highly suspicious. And crucially, there was a DNA match with the suspect and the DNA that had been found at many of those crime scenes. The forensic confirmation that linked him back to those offences that investigators had been looking at over many years.
And then, after all these years, finally, the legal process.
Yes, that was a bit of a farce. I mean, he was banged to rights, but he insisted on pleading not guilty, which, of course, is everybody's right. So it came to a trial at Woolwich Crown Court in 2011. He wasn't charged with every suspected crime, but a lot of them. And that came down to the strength of evidence and witnesses and the prosecution strategy. Grant denied that he was involved in anything.
And what was his defence?
Well, his defence was bizarre, nuts. He denied it all. He claimed that he'd been framed by his ex-wife, who, according to him, had somehow managed to store his semen and saliva over many years and then gone around at all the crime scenes and planted it. He suggested that his eldest son from his first marriage might be the culprit. Against overwhelming evidence, he came up with what was clearly a fantasy.
It's worth mentioning as well, isn't it, that often DNA is very powerful, DNA evidence is very powerful, but I don't think this was a full DNA sample. Wasn't it a partial sample?
Yes, I think in some examples it was. There were so many examples of his DNA at so many crime scenes over so many years. According to the prosecution, whatever the doubts, perhaps partial or full DNA profiles, the prosecution called it a coherent, corroborated pattern.
And what did the jury make of it all?
Well, bizarrely, it wasn't a unanimous verdict. You might think, having listened to that crazy, almost, defence, that he would have been readily convicted, but he wasn't. I mean, he was convicted of the 29 offences, but on a margin of 10-2. So there were two people on that jury who were convinced that he was innocent. The judge, Peter Rook, described Grant as a very evil man, capable of committing heinous crimes, a man who'd left a trail of distress, fear and misery. And he went on to tell Grant, "Your utter depravity knows no bounds." So he sentenced him to 4 life sentences with a minimum term of 27 years in jail.
And did the trial give any insight at all, Martin, into why Delroy Grant committed these, I don't know, it's hard to find an adjective, heinous, dreadful, terrible, heartbreaking crimes?
No, I don't think even Colin Sutton and those detectives who worked on it have to this day a really clear idea of why he committed those crimes in the way he did. I mean, and certainly Grant didn't offer any kind of explanation. I mean, when he was interviewed by the police, he refused to answer questions or, take part in any discussion of the attacks. Forensic psychologists suggested gerontophilia, that Grant was sexually attracted to the elderly. And I suppose that must have played a part. I mean, and it was certainly an intriguing element of it, but it doesn't fully explain the level of brutality that he attacked with. And of course, sometimes it wasn't like that at all. He would talk very gently to some of his victims and sometimes engage them in conversation for several hours, and on occasions didn't rape them, didn't sexually attack them. He could be quite conversational, even seemingly caring, sometimes supporting his victims' elbows as they moved around the house. And I suppose that's something that he learned from looking after his disabled wife. The victims got a clear idea, and certainly the police did, that he had experience of helping the elderly in some way. I mean, it was a kind of perverse tenderness. On one occasion, he kissed a victim's cheek.
I wonder if this was a bit of a power trip for him, that, he could switch from being brutal to oddly gentle and familiar, and perhaps a form of control, perhaps a way of exerting control over his victims.
Well, that was certainly the experience of some of his victims. He wasn't your classic rapist. And remember, this was a man who, by his neighbours' accounts, was caring lovingly for that sick wife. I think one of the many things that was shocking about this case was the locations where the Night Stalker struck. His victims weren't attacked in dark alleys or remote side streets or deserted parks. They were attacked where they were meant to be safest, in their bedrooms at home. Grant wasn't just attacking victims, he was invading their homes.
I think the shock and the fear and the whole trauma of these attacks, you wonder what true effect it had on the victims. Was there any evidence to suggest that perhaps they died sooner after going through something like this?
There was certainly evidence to suggest it, not enough to charge him with murder. But there were certainly victims who the prosecution and the police were convinced whose death was accelerated by the trauma that they'd suffered. And at least 7 of them had died by the time of the trial. Although remember, they were all pretty old anyway. One 93-year-old victim who was attacked and sexually assaulted in 2009 died 3 months later due to the trauma. An 85-year-old woman told the court that after the attack, she did what she said was a lot of locking and bolting and taking precautions. It changed my life. I found that time is not a great healer. nobody can guarantee it won't happen again. And the judge also quoted another victim who'd said, "It has ruined the winter years of my mother's life."
Gosh, that's such a heartbreaking quote. I mean, this case also says a lot about policing and also patience, doesn't it?
It shows that, police, like others, I suppose, are subject to human error. But persistence paid off, and persistence wouldn't happen unless you were very, very patient. And we've talked about those long, cold nights of that long surveillance operation. I mean, police later apologised for the missed opportunities that allowed him to carry on attacking victims. And there's always this thing about DNA. People think DNA is magic, but it's only as good as the moment that you can attach it to a suspect.
And we're going back quite a lot of years, aren't we? So, God forbid if that case were now, DNA testing's moved on and you can get further with a partial sample, etc. So I suppose, DNA hadn't come along quite as far as it had now. But also Grant's capture and arrest happened as a result of a really deliberate change of strategy by the police. Quite a bold move to take this massive surveillance operation and hope that he's going to sort of come into their net. It was quite a different way of looking at things, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's where Colin Sutton comes into the equation. He took over the investigation after, a good number of years. But he was new to that part of London. He didn't know the team that had been working on it. So he felt that he could be bold, and he came up with just a new way of doing things, and eventually it paid off.
Well, join us for the next episode when we'll be talking to Colin Sutton about the investigation from the inside, what it was like being brought into an infamous case and how you close the net. We'll talk about the choices, where to set up surveillance, how to use CCTV and vehicle sightings, how to manage pressure from above, and how to keep focus on victims for whose last years, in many cases, were destroyed by the Night Stalker. Join us for part 2. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.